David had always lived a life of comfort. Growing up in the Thompson household, he never lacked anything. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, ran a successful business, and his father had been a highly respected lawyer before his untimely passing. Their wealth had afforded David privileges, but it also made him somewhat indifferent to the struggles of those who weren't as fortunate. One evening, as David was immersed in his phone, his mother walked in with a young woman by her side. The girl looked around nervously, her hands clasped tightly together. She had a small bag slung over her shoulder, and her clothes, though clean, were simple and worn out. "David," Mrs. Thompson said, "this is Amina. She's from my friend's village. She will be staying with us and helping around the house." David barely looked up. "Okay, Mom." Amina offered him a shy nod, but he didn't acknowledge her. Little did David know, that moment marked the beginning of a story he would never forget. Amina was different from anyone David had ever met. She was quiet and kept to herself, always waking up before everyone else to clean the house and prepare breakfast. She didn't have a smartphone or spend time on social media. Instead, she found joy in simple things, like watching the birds outside the kitchen window or humming to herself while sweeping the floor. David, on the other hand, was glued to his digital world. He spent most of his time playing video games, chatting with friends, or scrolling endlessly through his phone. Amina's presence barely registered to him, until one fateful morning. He woke up to find her struggling with the coffee machine, her brows furrowed in concentration. She pressed buttons randomly, completely lost. "What are you doing?" he asked, slightly amused. I wanted to make coffee for your mother," she said, flustered. "But this machine is complicated." David chuckled and showed her how it worked. As he did, he noticed her hands, small but calloused, a clear sign of years of hard work. "Where did you live before coming here?" he found himself asking. Amina hesitated. "A small village, far from here. Life was different." She didn't say more, and David didn't press. But for the first time, he saw her as more than just the maid. Weeks passed, and Amina's presence in the house became more familiar. One evening, while looking for something in the study, David heard soft humming coming from the kitchen. He peeked inside and saw Amina sketching something in an old notebook. Curious, he walked over and glanced at the pages. His eyes widened. The sketches were breathtaking, detailed drawings of landscapes, faces, and intricate patterns. "You drew these?" he asked in astonishment. Amina jumped, quickly shutting the notebook. "It's nothing," she muttered. "This is more than nothing. You're incredibly talented." She looked away. "It's just a hobby." David frowned. "Have you ever thought about doing something with your art?" Amina sighed. "In my village, survival comes first. Dreams, they are a luxury." David was struck by her words. He had spent his whole life taking opportunities for granted, while Amina, despite her talent, had never had the chance to explore hers. And in that moment, he made a silent vow to change that. Determined to help Amina, David bought her a proper sketchbook and colored pencils. At first, she hesitated to accept them, but eventually, she did, with a shy but grateful smile. Slowly, their interactions grew. David found himself drawn to her resilience, her quiet strength. And Amina, despite her initial reservations, began to trust him. But not everyone was pleased. Mrs. Thompson noticed the growing closeness between them and was concerned. One evening, she pulled David aside. "She's not one of us, David," she said gently but firmly. "She comes from a different world. Be careful." David felt a pang of frustration. "Mom, she's not just the maid. She's talented. She's kind. She deserves a chance like anyone else." Mrs. Thompson sighed. "Just don't forget who you are." David didn't reply. But deep down, he knew, he couldn't ignore his feelings any longer. One evening, under a sky full of stars, David found Amina in the garden, sketching quietly. "Amina," he said, sitting beside her. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I think I'm falling for you." Amina's breath caught. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "David, we can't." "Why not?" "Your family. Society. They won't accept this." Do you care what they think? Amina hesitated, her heart warring with her mind. I care about you. And that's why this is dangerous. David took her hand. Then let's face it together. Tears welled in her eyes. And in that moment, Amina knew, her life was about to change forever. Would you fight for love, even against society's expectations? Let us know in the comments. The days following David's confession were filled with tension. Amina found herself avoiding him, afraid of what was brewing between them. But the mansion's walls had ears, and soon, the whispers began. Mrs. Thompson's close friend, Mrs. Caldwell, was the first to raise suspicion. Have you noticed the way your son looks at that girl? She asked over tea one afternoon. It's not appropriate. Mrs. Thompson frowned. She had noticed it too but had hoped it was just a passing phase. David knows better, she replied stiffly. But doubt crept into her voice. Meanwhile, the other house staff had their own opinions. Some were amused, others envious, and a few outright hostile. One of the older maids, Brenda, took it upon herself to warn Amina. You're playing a dangerous game, she said coldly. You think his family will let you, a maid, be with him? You're just a distraction. Amina said nothing, but the words stung. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Could she really let herself dream of something that was never meant to be? Despite the whispers, David and Amina continued to find moments together. But their happiness was short-lived. One evening, Mrs. Thompson called David into her study. She was standing by the window, her arms crossed. Is it true? She asked without turning around. David sighed. What have you heard? That you're getting too close to Amina. He hesitated, then met her gaze. I love her, Mom. Mrs. Thompson inhaled sharply. Love. David, this is ridiculous. She's a maid. Do you have any idea what people will say? I don't care what they say. Well, I do. Her voice was sharp now. You have a future, David. A respectable one. And I won't let you throw it away for a girl who has nothing. David clenched his fists. She's not nothing. She's the best person I know. Mrs. Thompson's expression darkened. Then you leave me no choice. The next morning, Amina was summoned to Mrs. Thompson's office. When she arrived, her heart dropped. Mrs. Thompson's eyes were cold. You will pack your things and leave by tonight. Amina gasped. But why? You know why. I will not allow you to corrupt my son's future. Tears welled in Amina's eyes, but she bowed her head. She had always known this was coming. Still, it didn't make it hurt any less. That night, she placed her sketchbook into her small bag and walked to the front door. Just as she reached for the handle, a voice stopped her. Where are you going? David stood at the top of the stairs, his eyes wild with panic. Amina wiped her tears. Your mother is sending me away. Like hell she is. He stormed past her and into his mother's study. You can't do this, he spat. You have no right. Mrs. Thompson didn't flinch. I have every right. This is my house. And as long as you live under my roof, you will follow my rules. David's voice was dangerously low. Then I won't live under your roof anymore. A stunned silence filled the room. David, Amina whispered, stepping forward. But he turned to her and took her hands. Come with me, Amina. Her heart pounded. Where? Anywhere. As long as it's together. And in that moment, Amina made the biggest decision of her life. The night air was crisp as David and Amina slipped out of the mansion. David had grabbed his backpack, stuffing it with clothes, his wallet, and anything they might need. Are you sure about this? Amina asked, her voice trembling. I've never been more sure. They walked quickly through the dimly lit streets, their hands intertwined. For the first time in her life, Amina wasn't running from something. She was running toward something. But freedom wouldn't come so easily. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson's fury knew no bounds. She called every friend, every connection she had, desperate to track them down. Find them, she ordered. Before it's too late. Meanwhile, David and Amina found themselves in a small motel, exhausted but exhilarated. What now? Amina asked, lying beside him on the bed. David smiled. Now, we build our own future. And as the first rays of dawn peeked through the window, they knew this was only the beginning. Would you leave everything behind for love? Let us know in the comments. David and Amina sat together in the dimly lit motel room, their fingers intertwined. For the first time, they were free. But the reality of their situation weighed on them heavily. We have to find jobs, Amina murmured. We can't survive on what little money you have. David nodded. I'll find something. We'll be okay. But the world outside wasn't as kind as David had imagined. With no experience, he struggled to find work. Amina, determined to help, took up a cleaning job at a small diner, working long hours to support them both. Every night, she returned exhausted, yet grateful for the little they had. One evening, David came home with a defeated look. I got turned down again. Amina touched his face gently. We'll find a way. But just as they began to settle into their new life, a shadow from their past emerged. Mrs. Thompson wasn't one to give up easily. Through her connections, she found them. One evening, as Amina walked home from work, she noticed a black car parked near the motel. A shiver ran down her spine. The feeling of being watched overwhelmed her. When she reached the room, she locked the door immediately. What's wrong? David asked. I think someone's following us. David's jaw tightened. We need to leave. Before they could pack, loud knocks echoed through the room. David, open this door. Now. His mother. David's heart pounded. Amina trembled. They were trapped. Mrs. Thompson entered, flanked by two men in suits. Her face was cold, unreadable. You've had your little rebellion, David. Now it's time to come home. I'm not going anywhere without Amina, he said firmly. Mrs. Thompson smirked. Oh, she's not coming with you. I'll make sure of that. David took Amina's hand. You can't control me anymore, mother. Mrs. Thompson's voice turned ice cold. If you walk away now, you lose everything. Your inheritance, your name, your future. Think carefully. Amina looked at him with tear-filled eyes. David, don't do this for me. David turned to his mother, his decision clear. I never cared about the money. I choose Amina. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flashed with anger. Then you are no son of mine. And with that, she turned and left. David stood still, processing what had just happened. He had lost his entire world, but gained something far greater. Amina wrapped her arms around him. We'll make it through. David held her tightly. We have to. But as they watched the black car disappear into the night, neither of them realized that their biggest challenges were yet to come. Would you give up your entire inheritance for true love? Let us know in the comments. The weight of David's decision settled over them like a storm cloud. He had chosen love over wealth, but the consequences were beginning to show. Days turned into weeks, and the little money they had was running out. David, once accustomed to luxury, found himself doing odd jobs, carrying groceries, cleaning tables, even washing cars. But work was scarce, and their motel bills were piling up. Amina, ever the optimist, tried to stay strong for both of them. We have each other, she whispered to him at night, tracing circles on his palm. But doubt had begun creeping into David's mind. Had he made a mistake? Had he doomed them both? One evening, he came home later than usual, his shirt soaked in sweat. I got a job at a construction site, he announced breathlessly. Amina beamed. That's amazing, David. It's hard work, but it pays decently, he admitted. Maybe we can finally start saving up for something better. But just as they started believing in a new future, fate had other plans. One afternoon, Amina was finishing her shift at the diner when a familiar voice startled her. Amina. She turned sharply. Standing before her was a man she never expected to see again. James Caldwell, David's childhood best friend. James had always been different from David. More pragmatic, more controlled. He had been the golden boy of their elite social circle, and now, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, he looked exactly the same. What are you doing here? She asked cautiously. I could ask you the same thing, he replied, his eyes scanning her uniform. But I already know the answer. Amina stiffened. David and I are doing fine. James smirked. Is that so? He pulled out his wallet and threw a thick wad of cash onto the counter. "Take this. Leave David." Amina's breath hitched. "Excuse me." "You heard me." James leaned in. "David isn't built for this life, Amina. He's struggling, and you know it. If you really love him, let him go." Amina's hands trembled as she stared at the money. The idea of relieving David's suffering, of giving him back his old life, was tempting. But at what cost? Slowly, she pushed the money back toward James. If David wanted that life, he would have chosen it. "He chose me." James's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Amina." "No," she said firmly. "You are." But James wasn't finished yet. As he walked out of the diner, he pulled out his phone. "She didn't take the money," he said to the person on the other end. Time for Plan B. That night, David returned home exhausted but hopeful. "Guess what?" he said, grinning. "My boss says if I keep this up, I might get promoted to site supervisor." Amina smiled, but something in her heart ached. Should she tell him about James? Should she warn him? Before she could decide, a knock at the door startled them both. David opened it cautiously, only to find a sharply dressed woman standing there. "David Thompson." "Yes." "You've been served." David's stomach dropped as he read the document in his hands. It was a lawsuit. His mother was suing him for fraudulent use of family assets, a fabricated claim, but one that could destroy him. And the lawyer handling the case, James Caldwell. Amina gasped. "David, this isn't just about money. They want to break you." David's grip on the paper tightened. "Then they'll have to try harder." But deep down, he knew they were running out of time. "If you were Amina, would you take the money and walk away? Or would you stay and fight? Let us know in the comments." David sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the lawsuit papers in disbelief. Amina watched him anxiously, her heart pounding. "We need a lawyer," she said softly. David let out a humorless chuckle. "With what money, Amina? We can barely afford rent." Tears pricked her eyes. She hated seeing him like this, so defeated. "Maybe," she hesitated, knowing what she was about to say would hurt him. "Maybe we should talk to James." David snapped his head up. "James? After what he pulled?" "I know, David," she said quickly, placing her hands on his. "But he's the only person who understands your family's tactics. Maybe he can help us." David clenched his jaw. The thought of asking James for help was unbearable. But was there any other choice? The next day, Amina met James at a high-end cafe downtown. He looked at her with an amused smile. "I knew you'd come." She exhaled sharply. "Drop the lawsuit." James sipped his coffee leisurely. "That's not how this works, Amina." "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "You used to be David's best friend." James leaned forward, his gaze darkening. "Because David was supposed to take over the Thompson empire. Instead, he threw it all away, for you." Amina swallowed hard. "So this is about power." James smirked. "It always is." Then he lowered his voice. "There's only one way out of this, Amina. Leave David. If you disappear, I'll make sure this lawsuit vanishes too." Her stomach twisted. "You're asking me to break his heart." James shrugged. "Better a broken heart than a destroyed future." Amina stared at him, her mind racing. Could she really walk away from David to save him? That night, Amina sat by David's side as he slept. Her fingers brushed against his cheek, memorizing every detail of his face. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, David woke up to find a letter on the nightstand. His heart stopped as he unfolded the paper. "David, I love you more than anything, and that's why I have to leave. This life, this struggle, it's because of me. You deserve better. And I won't be the reason you lose everything. Please don't come looking for me. This is for the best. Amina." David dropped the letter, his hands trembling. "No, no." He rushed out of the motel, calling her name. But she was gone. And James? He watched from a distance, a satisfied smirk on his face. Amina had nowhere to go. She wandered the city until exhaustion overtook her. Finally, she found a cheap hostel and checked in. Days turned into weeks. She found a job as a seamstress, working long hours, her heart aching every second. She didn't check her phone, afraid of what she might see. One evening, as she walked home, a black car pulled up beside her. Before she could react, the door opened, and she was yanked inside. She gasped as she came face to face with Mrs. Thompson. "You didn't think I'd let you walk away that easily, did you?" Amina's blood ran cold. David had spent weeks searching for Amina. He had nothing left, his money was gone, his heart shattered. But he refused to believe she had left him willingly. Then, one evening, a letter arrived at the motel. No return address. No name. Just a single sentence. "She's with your mother." David's eyes darkened. It was time to fight back. If you were Amina, would you have sacrificed your love for David's future? Let us know in the comments. Amina's breath came in shallow gasps as the car sped through the dimly lit streets. Mrs. Thompson sat beside her, a cold smirk playing on her lips. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said. Amina clenched her fists. "You have no right to keep me here." Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "Oh, but I do. I gave you a chance to disappear, but you just had to be stubborn." The car stopped in front of a massive estate, one of the Thompson family's private properties, hidden away from the public eye. Amina was dragged inside, taken to a lavish room, and the door locked behind her. She was a prisoner. David wasted no time. He stormed into his mother's estate, rage burning in his veins. He knew she had Amina, and he wasn't going to leave without her. The guards blocked his path. "You are not allowed here, Mr. Thompson." David clenched his jaw. "Let me see her." Mrs. Thompson appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her expression cold and unwavering. "David, darling, this obsession has to stop. You've humiliated this family enough." "Where is she?" he demanded. She smirked. "Safe. That's all you need to know." David felt his blood boil. "If you hurt her." Mrs. Thompson raised a hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. I merely relocated her. But if you continue this rebellion, I may have to reconsider how merciful I am." David knew threats when he heard them. His mother wasn't just trying to keep them apart, she was planning something bigger. He had to act fast. Amina paced her lavish prison, thinking of ways to escape. Every window was locked, every door guarded. But she had spent years being underestimated. If there was one thing she had learned, it was how to survive. She started talking to the maid who brought her meals, a young woman named Elena. "Do you have a family?" Amina asked one evening. Elena hesitated before nodding. "A little brother. He's sick. I need this job to pay for his treatment." Amina saw an opportunity. "What if I told you I could help? If you let me go, I'll make sure your brother gets the best care." Elena's eyes darted to the door. "They'll kill me if they find out." "They won't," Amina said firmly. "I just need a phone. One call, and we're both free." Elena wavered. Then, after a tense moment, she reached into her apron and handed Amina a burner phone. "You have 5 minutes." Amina dialed the only number she trusted. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello." Amina's voice came through, breathless. "David. It's me. I don't have much time." His heart slammed in his chest. "Where are you?" "A mansion outside the city." "Your mother." The line went dead. David cursed, shoving his phone into his pocket. He knew where she was. And he was done playing by the rules. That night, under the cover of darkness, he gathered a few trusted friends and made his move. David stormed into the estate, his heart pounding. The guards tried to stop him, but he fought his way through, adrenaline fueling his every move. He reached Amina's room and kicked the door open. She gasped, rushing into his arms. "David!" Mrs. Thompson's voice rang out behind them. "Going somewhere?" David turned to see his mother standing with James, both calm, collected. "You're making a mistake, son," Mrs. Thompson said smoothly. "If you leave with her now, you'll lose everything." David tightened his grip on Amina's hand. "Then I lose everything." Mrs. Thompson's face darkened. "You'll regret this." David smiled. No, mother. You will. With that, he turned and walked out, Amina by his side. And for the first time in his life, he was truly free. Would you have risked everything like David, or tried to negotiate with his mother? Let us know in the comments.